Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jean-Philippe. If I may add one element, is that I'm currently at the moment also a research fellow at KI's Bochum, which is for Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum, which is an excellent research institution, and I'm very grateful to be there. So thank you. I'm greatly honored by the opportunity to deliver a keynote at this. Thank you. At this very important and hopefully interesting occasion. I would like to talk about 3 topics, or to cover 3 issues. Yes. What are the trends in trust, first of all? So I built my presentation on the assumption that we live in an era where trust in public institutions, but also trust in general, is on the decline. And I will argue that this is to a great part because of the transformed information environment, which has generated an epistemic chaos in society, and which has also given rise to the worldwide populistic wave of populism, which aims to undermine trust and stability. Judiciary, I will focus on judiciary in this talk, but sometimes I also include other legal professions. So I regard courts and the media as being on the same platform as #1 targets of authoritarian populisms because of their controlling role that they normally fulfill in democracies. When I say information environment, I'm thinking of that huge ocean of information, which is very diverse. I will elaborate more on that. And I will explain that I regard media also as a victim to this transformation because it is also losing trust, losing influence. And I will explain how and why it came to that. So, first of all, in an era of declining trust in public institutions and including courts, trust is becoming a central issue in our societies. This has been a feature for democratic societies for quite some time, partly due to what I just mentioned, the worldwide wave of populism and of the informational transformation, where I identify populism as a political communication strategy, whereas there are different interpretations in political science. But I am thinking of populism as a strategy for political communication, which uses as one of its major tools strategic disinformation in an attempt to undermine stability and trust in the establishment, in the public institutions, to raise disbelief in objective truth, established truth, and questioning or even denigrating expertise of many kinds, including legal expertise as well. And while they are pretending to impart novel ideas and promise to deliver solutions to unsolved social challenges and political problems, the real intention is rather to grab power, or at least to weaken public institutions, government, public administration, the judiciary, or even the faith in objective truth symbolized by the media, by the power of media, with the strategic goal of lowering the costs of an intervention, of ignoring or even eroding those public institutions when they get to power, basically paving the way for them to bypass the system of checks and balances when they are in power. Now, to see some statistics, the trust in judiciary is not at all that bad, with 53% and relatively stable within the European Union. It's better than that of the European Parliament. So 53% of European citizens who were surveyed held that the judiciary is very good or fairly good, and only 36 thought that it's very bad or fairly bad. This roughly corresponds to the survey of the OECD, which is 56% in 2022, whereas the European Court of Justice is also rather stable with 50%, Also noteworthy may be that the range of the European Court of Justice is much narrower than the range of the national judiciaries. So whereas this nice 53% of trust in national judiciaries is added through a big range between 17% in the less lucky countries and 83% in or 86% in Scandinavian countries. Maybe it's not a secret if I say. The respect and trust for the European Court of Justice shows much more stability between 33 and 73%. Yes, we don't always have comparative statistics. For example, the OECD statistics cover basically trust in the government and other public institutions. But one thing is quite informative. The courts fare generally better than governments, which is supposed to be a logical phenomenon. And it has been observed that the more vulnerable persons are, the less trust they put in governments. So lower education, lower income, younger age, they are all factors which diminish trust invested in governments. For example, young people have 10% less trust than the average. Women have 2.7% trust than the average. And interestingly, the perceived vulnerabilities influence this discrepancy even more than the actual difference in income, up to 23%. And for example, having a university degree raises the likelihood by 8% that someone trusts the government, which leads us to the conclusion that the more vulnerable someone are, the more suspicious he is against government, which is obviously a reasonable attitude, but trust in courts is supposed to show an opposite direction, because courts theoretically control power, including executive power. So the vulnerable people ideally should feel protected by legality. This is also shown by the correlation of trust in, the trust in courts and independence. There is a strong correlation between trust in courts and independence. Yes, this is not this is the slide which is coming now. According to Frans van Dijk, he found that trust is basically the same as independence, because there is such a strong correlation. According to his formulation, trust is faith in the independence of the courts. And I would add that it may be healthy to have a certain level of suspicion in governments, but for courts, the more trust, the better. Nevertheless, in this pattern of vulnerabilities, what we can observe fits into the broader pattern of the feelings of disempowerment in society, which I will also touch later. So now I would also like to briefly discuss what we can understand by trust in courts, because trust for courts is obviously different from trust in other public institutions, partly because courts, at least in the continental legal system, are typically not operating and not elected through the democratic principle, but rather by the professional principle. So they don't need to be popular to function optimally. Of course, they have democratic legitimacy, but their independence distances them from the demos and also from the other powers. So their independence is the key to their trustworthiness. Well, trust has been interpreted in various manners in literature, but I try to simplify it very much. We can nevertheless further deconstruct trust into components. For example, I am offering here distinction of rational and irrational elements of trust, where the rational component is basically the perception of having control over the judicial process, having some sort of control. And I'm using the word perception of having this control, not actual control. This is expressed in the values of procedural fairness, like impartiality, neutrality, and partly independence also plays a role here. So fairness gives this perception of having control, or at least that no other parties exercise undue control over that process. Whereas the irrational part is also known as the social capital of the institution. It's basically the acceptance, public acceptance of the authority of a court. And I'm again citing Frans van Dijk, who said that acceptance of authority requires a certain level of faith, and the court's authority depends on the public acceptance of the role, not least because they don't have their own executive function. So they rely on the executive for the enforcement of their decisions. But if we take the assumption that ideally court decisions are voluntarily followed, that should root in an acceptance, in a voluntary acceptance of faith in the authority of the court. And this faith lies in that the court will fulfill the expectations of the clients, of the society, or in other words, that it is predictable. And in order to prove whether the court actually fulfilled those expectations, the values of accountability and transparency serve us. So after all, if we further deconstruct this so-called irrational component, we find that it's still rational, because accountability and transparency will help us to see whether the court lives up to those expectations and whether the faith invested in the court system is justified. Where accountability should be interpreted as a balance of independence, a counterpart of independence, in fact, because a court that is 200% independent can often be viewed as arbitrary or irresponsible or overly active, which is something that constitutional courts are often accused of, being overly active. And it also includes good reasoning, so clear justification of the decisions. That's accountability, whereas transparency means the knowledge about all this, about the objectivity, the impartiality, independence of the courts, or if anomalies are reported, that the court takes the measures, the necessary steps, and reports about that information, including also communicating and engaging with the citizens. There's a saying which says that to know courts is to love them. It pops up again and again in the literature, but it has also been found that this is actually only true in the context when courts are independent and the citizens are aware of the importance of independence, so they have basically some sort of literacy in the rule of law. And when we say faith, it's to a great extent faith in the independence of the courts, that it will resist power pressures, especially that of the executive power, because the courts are the watchers of the watchers. And this is particularly relevant in these times when independence of the judiciary is under political pressure or explicit attacks in various countries, even in the European Union and outside of the European Union. As Andrew Arato said, the court's capacity to resist pressures toward even illiberal forms of government affects their ability to preserve public support. So logically, they are the number one targets, populist governments and corrupt governments, not to mention populist and corrupt governments, regard courts as public enemies. For them, they could look as the elitist obstacles to the will of the people. Now let's talk about the media. Trust in the media is by and large similar to that in the courts, 50%. Although there is some difference if we compare EU and OECD data, the EU fares better on media trust than the OECD average, which is only 38%, but less well than court trust, so that was higher in the OECD average. As I mentioned, my presumption is that they both exercise control over executive power, and that's why they are the first targets of authoritarian populistic regimes. For example, in Hungary, it was the media which was first taken under attack after Orban got the power in 2010. Then he took the Constitutional Court and other branches of the legal system, and basically the judiciary remained the last outpost of freedom, so to say, despite the constant pressures and attempts to dominate the court. But still, the judiciary, I would say, is still perhaps the only branch or subsystem of the state which is still alive and kicking. Whereas in Poland, they started right away with the judiciary and then took the media. Of course, the main attacks are not merely rhetoric, but they happen by abusive laws or lawsuits. However, they are always supported by populistic narratives. For example, in Poland, that's not Poland anyway, in Poland, the official party narrative identified the judges as representatives of the old communist regime, depicted them as representing the communists or being themselves the old communist elites. And also in Hungary, the same narrative served as a support for the illegal removal of the judges at the beginning of the Orban regime, to remove all the judges, which allowed their replacement with younger and loyal judges. These narratives are the most often that judges are labeled as servants of a corrupt elite, or when there are controversial or politically loaded judicial cases, judicial decisions, then the legitimacy of these decisions are attacked, or judges participating in decision-making are accused with bias, corruption, or tempered evidence. Like, for example, in the cases related to election fraud charges in the United States, or relating to disinformation cases in Brazil. And to this can come personal attacks on judges, including deepfakes, smear campaigns, which can amount up to coordinated social media campaign attacks, like the one in Poland, when an online trolling campaign was designed to smear a group of judges whose rulings were critical of the government. And as it was later revealed by investigative independent journalism, this campaign was designed inside the Ministry of Justice of Poland. Or like in Hungary, when two representatives of the Judicial Council met the US ambassador, upon which they were attacked and accused by the governmental propaganda channels and also by the Parliamentary Committee of Justice with conspiracy with the United States, which is an associate country of Hungary, of course, and demanded their resignation. However, courts may also play a relevant role in the fight against disinformation, especially that our current laws are not fit to deal with this very complicated problem. For example, Brazilian High Court decisions have laid the legal basis and also sanctioned citizens, politicians, and also social media platforms, and ordered the removal of political disinformation content items during the presidential campaign. In fact, already from 2020 onwards, up to the elections in 2022, in particular in relation with Bolsonaro's election campaign. It must be added to cover the complete picture that when Bolsonaro lost the elections, the building of the Supreme Court was attacked by the disappointed supporters of Bolsonaro violently, who accused the Supreme Court with interfering into elections with these decisions. Nevertheless, I hold still that case law could help to develop the necessary legal principles on the limits of freedom of expression in the cases of harmful disinformation. But we also have to note that at the same time, courts are not necessarily optimally equipped to assess the consequences of what is harmful disinformation, because that requires interdisciplinary research. Now, let me guide your attention to the transformed informational environment. As we all know, it has completely transformed in past decades. We hardly even know what to call media today. The entry barriers have vanished. Actually, I was thinking whether to put a chimpanzee on the picture, because even chimpanzees can use the social media, and then I didn't do it because I read that it was considered unethical to show chimpanzees in that situation, because of the dignity of the chimpanzee, of course. So everybody, even a chimpanzee, would be capable to share content or to post its own content or to share, disseminate other people's content, participating in the amplification of information. And the vehicle of this transformation has been primarily the social media, which provides a very user-friendly interface to do this. It aggregates content and allows the dissemination content along opaque and intransparent algorithmic logic that we are still unaware of, even though there is already some regulation on that, but it couldn't really achieve a transparency of that algorithmic logic. And this openness, this vastness of the information landscape provides users the illusion of freedom, pluralism, and empowerment. But that just remains what I called it, an illusion, because the real political processes did not adapt to the changes, to this changed transparency of the political discourse. And the political processes and the policies often are still not responding to the real pressing needs and frustrations in society, even though these needs and frustrations are now expressed as opposed to the 80s, 1980s, for example. But still, the political processes do not follow this trend. And this leads to a frustration and a general feeling of disappointment in those parts of the population who basically emerge in this free information environment, whereas they didn't have their voices heard previously. And this provides an easy entry point to populistic political rhetoric, which promises to make a change, but without the intention and the capability to achieve those necessary changes. It has been showed by research that populistic politicians have used social media much more intensively than other politicians. This is partly because social media allows them a direct access to their supporters, to their voters, without the mediating function, the interpreting or moderating function of journalists. We are now beyond that first phase of disinformation campaigns, which I put to the 1916s and 2016-2018 period, where those staggering organized disinformation campaigns were mainly foreign originated and used as a hybrid weapon by Russia, China, Iran, and some other countries. But soon were the techniques and also the content memes taken over by domestic networks of disinformation, partly for the same strategic political reasons as the foreign actors used them, but also partly because parts of the population developed a true belief in those disinformation stories, like the supporters of the Canon movement, of the Trump's election denial campaign, COVID hesitancy, climate denial, and we could list those topics where a true belief has developed in the population, perhaps sometimes in spite of the information originally originating from a strategic disinformation network. When social groups start to believe and support disinformation ideas and conspiracy theories, fighting against disinformation becomes significantly more complicated, if not impossible, because this is the same as if we would fight against fairy tales or the myth of Santa Claus or religion in the society, which are objectively untrue stories, but honestly believed by people. As long as they are not directly harmful against a specific, so for a specific individual, they are protected information. So for this reason, the distinction between disinformation and misinformation has almost completely lost its relevance. The Code of Practice Against Disinformation offered social media platforms to commit themselves to remove and demonetize or demote and demonetize disinformation, but in fact, these social media platforms in their own standards, they only use the word misinformation, which allows them to not look behind the information and not search for the motive of the publisher, but merely focus on the content that it's an untrue content, which is of course not good from the freedom of expression perspective. And also, we don't yet know how this whole Code of Practice Against Disinformation and the co-regulation structure will work. At the moment, it seems that it's not super effective. Another example, Russia Today, or RT, it applied disinformation as a hybrid weapon, a targeted and hybrid weapon, and it was categorized as a weapon by the European Commission. That's why it could be banned. Even that is highly debated. But it is utterly impossible to ban domestic operators just because they echo foreign propaganda or foreign disinformation. And in addition to that, if disinformation is disseminated or even supported by a government or just by persons in high authority, high political authority, or perhaps just high authority, its impact is significantly larger. For example, if disinformation attacks on courts come from the government, then judges need really a great deal of stamina and strength to demonstrate resilience. Now, some media service providers are guilty of spreading disinformation, but overwhelmingly this is committed by networks of strategic dissemination which forge, create, and spread the disinformation because it's against the interest of any real media service provider, as disinformation undermines trust also in the media, as in all established legal systems in democracy or in democratic institutions. Therefore, I don't even like to mix the topics in a talk on media profession and disinformation. I regard disinformation not even as information because I think it's the opposite of information. It aims at concealing information. In my view, disinformation pollutes the information environment so that it becomes more difficult for the audience to encounter truth. And I emphasize that this is the main goal of disinformation, to raise distrust in public institutions, including the media, and to sow confusion so that even true information seems unconvincing or inauthentic. Even true information is not believed after that. And this is what generates an epistemic chaos in society, when a large part of users are uncertain where they can find truthful information. So in my imagination, the information environment is like a large pool, which is at the same time diluted very much and polluted. It's diluted with lots of entertainment, user-generated content, one-time snippets of minor information like short videos and you name it. And at the same time also very polluted by disinformation, specifically design information debris to pollute this information environment. So what will be the role of media, professional media in this picture? Obviously, the social role of professional media could be even more relevant, important than in the previous media environment, because they could form islands of trustworthy information. But sadly, the power of traditional media has been curtailed by social media providers. I mean, mainly by the new business model of platform economy. While earlier media companies attracted income from advertisers and also from their subscriber base, in the new business model, social media providers are the main aggregators. They are the ones who attract advertisement resources, part of which is channeled to some publishers, but basically journalists, like on the force among the many actors, have lost their direct access to the audience to some extent. Obviously, there are still very successful journalists which have a large subscription base, especially in some countries like Germany, but this is not the case in every state or even member state of the European Union. And what I find very important, that the position of professional media has degraded to just to being one of the many clients of social media platforms. So they are on the same page, the same side as users and the other peer-to-peer publishers in an environment, in a business model which is dominated to 100% by social media platforms. And the new European Media Freedom Act is trying to make a few very timid alterations to this picture by promising media service providers some minor privileges against social media platforms. But the problem and the main difficulty is that it's objectively impossible to really distinguish between those actors like users, influencers, citizen journalists, or even rogue disinformants, which is aggravated by the fact that there are some rogue media service providers who, although they are professional, traditional media service providers, but still they are consciously and intentionally and regularly engaged in imparting disinformation in some countries, for example, the United States, and in the backsliding democracies. Of course, there are a few qualitative features which might be helpful in distinguishing these actors, but they are different from what we have used in the last century. For example, the institutional setting is not guiding any longer, and it's also not registration as a journalist or the genre, and neither is their profit-oriented or non-profit nature. These are all irrelevant, because citizen journalists wouldn't fulfill any of these criteria and still could provide very authentic and valuable information. Probably what I currently see, the only authentic distinctive factor could be whether a publisher de facto complies with those ethical journalistic standards that have been developed by the journalistic profession. But even then, we have the open question, who decides what those standards are, especially in the changing environment, and who will oversee compliance with those standards? For example, under this mentioned European Media Freedom Act draft, currently it is up to social media providers to decide whether they accept or reject the declaration of a media service provider, whether they consider themselves a media service provider or not. Well, this is not exactly helpful to balance the power, to correct the power balance between traditional media and social media platforms. So the only effective change would be a complex improvement in this sea of information. Even if we have a large, dirty pool of information, there should be islands of trust. Providers that offer consistently verified, fact-checked, complete, authentic information, respectful of ethical principles. But in addition, the users also need to know where they find this information. For example, public service media in some lucky states where they really act as serving the public could fulfill this role. Or during the COVID crisis, decentralized authorities of health, offices of health authorities also fulfilled this role. They could operate, these trusted actors could operate as networks of information oases. And the networking is a key word in this fight, because also these information operators work in networks, and because in this networked environment, isolated users or isolated publishers are incomparably less powerful than networks which can support each other. One possible improvement could be gained by professional media networks formed by media outlets which would mutually attest each other's quality to inform the audience about this quality. For example, providing membership labels of this network. So this would be a network of proved, fact-checked, objective media outlets, which could also serve as signposts of the right direction towards trusted information islands. Even courts could give such labels to those media providers which have reported authentically about the judicial processes or court matters in general. So ultimately, and to wrap up my presentation, media and courts both have the potential to serve as pillars of trust in society. Media by fulfilling its traditional watchdog role and scrutinizing the entire system, including courts, and courts in the described manner by realizing fairness, independence, accountability, transparency, and fulfilling both the rational and irrational components of trust. They are also both watchdogs of democracy. So allow me this picture where I found a picture of a dog, which is also a pillar. So at the same time, watchdogs and pillars, but they also mutually supervise each other, media through its reporting on the courts and courts through their decisions when there is a case, for example, on disinformation. And just one more sentence, one last outlook for the future. With the involvement of AI, artificial intelligence, in both the legal profession, the functioning of the judiciary, and other legal professions, and also in the media, in particular, I'm thinking of the generative AI models, the reconsideration of the ethical standards and what we mean by transparency have to be done, and those principles have to be adapted to the new situation. Thank you very much for your attention.